So this part 3, third part and last part of our close reading of Gary Snyder's The Great Clod, picks up where part 2 left off. Surprise, surprise. That last one left off, of course, with this argument that he makes that we can think of Shang Dynasty slaves as being that time's oil, and Bronze Age technology as being that age's uranium. So we pick up from that point. The invention of writing, analogous to the computer today, and a class of clerks provides the organizing pathways for rechanneling wealth away from its makers. So he's making a very strong argument that civilization itself engenders a kind of inequality among people, and also accelerates damage to the non-human natural world, to nature. This results in this other very striking claim. Essentially, from about 1500 BC, the balance of man and nature and the standard of living of the farming people in China begin to go down. Life gets worse for many people. Now, whether that has turned around in recent years as modern China has lifted many people out of poverty, famously, the narrative goes, that's a really good question. How sustainable is that? That's another good question. What happens if it's not sustainable? That's yet another good question. This parallel is part of his larger argument. He writes here, it may be that the parallel between our own fossil fuel era is apt. And you'll note that he's suggesting this. He's not asserting it in an incredibly strong way. He's inviting us to think about it. It may be that it's apt. Energy beyond imagining. Quote, energy slaves available. Okay, so whether you're a Shang Dynasty ruler who has slaves at your disposal to do everything for you and build your civilization, or you're me, right? I can order food, the guy will bring it to me. I can do all kinds of things that would have made the Shang Dynasty emperors just sick with envy, right? But Snyder's saying that it throws a whole society off keel into excess, confusion, and addiction. Let's stop for a moment and think about that claim. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about the question of the Anthropocene is how difficult it is to imagine the kinds of change that might make for a better future rather than a worse one, right? How do we get off oil? Is that possible? Can we do it? Don't we need it? How do we minimize or alter our habits of consumption or energy use? These are big questions. It's easy to think that what people who argue for alternatives to our present civilization are saying is, oh, we should go back to the Stone Age. Don't be fooled by that. It's also quite easy to recognize that there are means of energy generation and technology that are less damaging to the environment. Solar power is a good example. Sitting here in the sun, and it's the source of all the energy that we use. Can we tap directly into it? There's a lot of really smart scientists developing really great technology that makes it better and easier to do that than ever before. The question then, if we follow Snyder's thinking, might be, with the hierarchy that presently exists, with the structure of society that depends on energy slaves, in this case oil, and that depends on, therefore, a kind of stratification with people who are very poor, people who are very rich, and so forth. Will that accept that transition? Or is there some way to move into a place where people aren't trash picking on Dandora Dump in Kenya, while other people are living in multi-billion-dollar, mansions, or multi-million at the very least, right, with billions of dollars at their disposal. So here we can see that, at least in Snyder's view, the kinds of issues we saw in the film Anthropocene, The Human Epoch, are really live all throughout human history, right? Inequality is intimately tied into energy use and resource use, which the higher it gets, does more damage to non-human natural systems, and so forth. As we advance in this section on writing and slaves, moving through some evidence and examples and illustrations, we get to another interesting claim. Civilization came to China, and again, remember what civilization means to Snyder. It seems 1,500 years later than it did to the ancient Near East. That is just to say that in the area of contemporary Iraq, the Fertile Crescent, the kinds of changes we're talking about in the Yellow River Valley were already underway for a long time before they began to really take root in what we now call China. But, he argues, the Neolithic had been around just as long as it had been in that part of the world, in the West, so-called West. Thus, he says, China gets less civilization and more Neolithic. What an interesting argument. What a strange claim. It's empirically sound. Now, what do we do with it? And we see what Snyder does with it. He actually prefers some things about the Neolithic to some things about civilization. What will we learn about this curious argument, which seems counterintuitive? Do you want us to go back to the Stone Age, Gary Snyder? I'm not giving up my, car and my iPhone so that, you can, feel good about yourself in relation to nature. I'll let you all go deeper into this argument as we move through it. I just want to call out some of the key claims and advise you as you become better and closer readers to look for those core claims, those interesting moments when the writer is doing something distinct, and highlight those, recognize how they link up, find a key word and follow it, whether it be civilization or Neolithic in this case, and see what the writer is doing. In class on Friday, what we're going to do is look at some of the sources that he uses, including this translation of a poem or a song from the Shijing, the classic of poetry or songs, which in the evidence shows, goes back to the oral traditions, was written down, and is a kind of song simply about gathering plants and reflecting on human nature. We'll talk about that in class. This next section is an important one, isn't it? The way. We know that this is the Tao. So, halfway through this essay, he begins to talk about something different. It's not just the history of civilization as it becomes more hierarchical, more structured, more energy hungry, and more destructive to the non-human natural world, but now he's talking about belief systems and philosophy. So he begins to talk about, he gives us a brief review of Confucian thought, of Mohist thought. He talks a little bit about a couple of other schools of thought, legalism, and then he gets to the real prize, right? What he really wants us to focus on. He's given us a problem. Civilization is enormously destructive. And then he gives us at least an approach to thinking about how we might, if not solve that problem, then make it less intense. And that is philosophical Taoism, which he calls the most striking worldview in the whole Far East, and one of the world's top 2 or 3. It's interesting to rank it that way. Maybe it's number 1. But in his view, right, this is a core worldview. What does he like about it? It is a thoroughgoing critique or criticism of an entire society, of civilization itself. Moving further, he begins to represent Taoism to his reader. He's showing his reader what Taoism is, in his view, and he uses an excerpt from, this turns out to be an excerpt from Zhuangzi. We'll talk about this in class a little bit more on Thursday, because I want to talk about the way he uses these texts with you, not just lecture on the structure of his argument. But you can see that he's interested in an argument that comes from a pre-civilized world. We can talk about his argument about the matrilineal or mother-oriented nature of that, and how and why that's important when we talk on Thursday. He gives us an example from Liezi to help us show that Taoists were good observers who rose above human-centered utilitarianism. Now, this is an important part of his argument. Civilization is in part a means of using the world, utilizing the world, utilitarian approach to the world. The natural resources are there for extracting and turning into something useful to what? To our human-centered sense of importance, right? Perhaps without thought for the cost, the true cost of that process. That's the argument. Here we have a repost to that from Liezi, the third of our Taoist thinkers. Once again, we'll talk about Liezi, this text, in class on Thursday. Yet another quote, and here he's, presenting us with these block quotes in a way that I'd like you to closely observe and learn from. He's giving us these block quotes, and he's doing a considerable amount of interpretation and explanation. And some of it comes from other sources, some of it he's bringing to the text himself, but it all is advancing his argument. So he's chosen something we've read, right, in a different translation from the Tao Te Ching, chapter 6, from Lao Tzu. One thing that you can do with a block quote, and I hope you all learn from this, is present the block quote and then immediately summarize it, right? So summarize some aspect of it. Why is this important to you, your argument, and for your reader to understand? Here he tells us that the Tao Te Ching quote he just presented us with tells us that we should do nothing against the flow. What does that mean? As we begin to think more deeply with these Taoist texts, in the context of the question of the Anthropocene, what would that mean? What would that look like? And can we do something that would be closer to that ideal? Is that a way to think our way and behave, act our way out of the fix we're in if we take what the scientists are telling us seriously, which is that we are at a really critical turning point in human history. Snyder's made his argument and is moving into a kind of conclusion here. He talks briefly about the southern Chu way of viewing the world, which is complementary to but different from that more northern Yellow River Chinese school of thinking or schools of thought. He gives us this interesting final section, Salt and Iron, which reinforces some of what he's given us previously and brings in yet another source, this case a great historian, Sima Qian, who is responsible for much of what we know about ancient Chinese history. And this is it. The end of the essay, it's a strange conclusion. He doesn't conclude it in the way many writers might conclude an essay. Instead, he's, in a sense, reflecting on how after a certain point in Chinese history, things more or less went in a particular direction. Centralized imperial nation, that was in contact with other empires of its time. Now we're in, the Common Era. We're out of the before Common Era, BC or BCE. We're thinking about the Han Dynasty. And then he talks about this breakup, just like the Zhou did, into smaller powers and states. And he's invoking this historical cycle that we're still in. The People's Republic of China is arguably broken free of the dynastic cycle, right? The revolution of 1912, and then the founding in 1949 of the People's Republic of China. But we can still see aspects, perhaps, of this long history in contemporary China, in particular as it now vies on a global level for influence, for access to resources, for power, and so forth, economic and otherwise, right, with what are effectively de facto empires like the United States, essentially the European Union, arguably Russia and India, and we have the world and its future before us. Where are we headed? And what can we learn from the past? That's where I'll leave it, and I look forward to talking about this text more with you on Thursday.